Okay, clickbait time. And a lot of the hobbies I have, and I have too many of them, miniature painting, aquarium building, all this stuff. Something I see a lot on YouTube is these sort of like X in 5 levels of expertise or 3 levels of expertise, whatever, where they show you what a beginner does, an intermediate does, an advanced does. It kind of breaks it down. And I thought it'd be fun to do this with Designer. And I pitched it to the Patreon. It seemed like I didn't think anyone would want it because it seemed a little cheesy to me, but people really wanted to see it. So ask and you shall receive. That's what we're doing today. We're going to go through making this material from, it's in 3 versions, a basic, an intermediate, and advanced. The basic is sort of like what I see from students when they're just learning Designer and they're maybe making their first, handful of materials. It's the type of stuff I commonly see. The advanced one is after people have done probably about like 14 weeks, it's kind of like 4 to 6 months of practice in Designer, and they're able to make these like fairly convincing pieces, I think. But it's still missing a bunch of stuff. We're going to get into the specifics about the characteristics of what I consider like a beginner material, an advanced material, and an intermediate material, talk about the differences of them, and walk through the 3 graphs for each, and just talk about the kind of points of interests of what makes this basic, in my opinion, what makes this intermediate, in my opinion, or advanced, right? And how you move from one to the next. Because it's my opinion that a lot of you are much closer to that next kind of level than you actually think you are. Most of what Designer is a lot of relatively simple things stacked on top of each other so many times that it creates complexity and a lot of visual interest, but is actually quite simple at its core. It looks complicated, right? We're going to look through these graphs. I counted the nodes on each of these graphs to see how big they are. Now, I don't think total amount of nodes is a good proxy for how good a material will look or how complicated it will look. But if I were going to do that, I think this is actually not a bad measurement in this case. So this first node, or first graph rather, the basic material, this comes out to 108 nodes, which actually is surprising to me. It's a lot more than I thought, but that's fairly typical, I'd say. And this is a very simple graph. Going to the next graph, the intermediate level, this jumps up to 329. So it's almost exactly 3 times as much, weirdly, but that's where I think the biggest jump is getting out of that kind of basic level and hitting that intermediate level is where there's the biggest room for like huge impactful improvements that are very visibly seen, right? It's obvious when someone hits that level. And I've experienced that a lot in teaching where I go, oh, the person has just hit a big level up, right? They dinged into intermediate for sure. So it's a big jump there. The advanced graph here, this is 657 nodes, which I've never counted. I've never done this before. It was fun to do, to go through and actually count the amount of, I had a system to do it, but I had to go through and count them. And I was surprised at how many there are. Like I'm almost, closer to 1,000 than 0. But you'll find that a lot of this stuff is duplicates. A lot of it is stuff like just blends and transforms. It's simple things. It's relatively few big, cool tricks, which we will look through. We're going to talk a little about pixel processors, a lot of stuff on cracks, a lot of stuff on pattern making we're going to get into. But it's a lot of generally simple things stacked on top of each other with very few kind of cool parts, which we'll go over in this video kind of roughly. We got to try to keep it under 2 hours would be my hope. If you want, on the Patreon, I have the full rebuild of the advanced material, right? The highest level one. So it's a 7-hour tutorial, which is insane. But that was a 7-hour real-time build for me. Now, while I'm building that, I'm explaining every choice I make, why I'm making it. I assume no knowledge about substance. So if you're brand new, you should be able to get the advanced graph out of it if you were to follow it node for node and follow my teaching there and understand it. If you go on that, you can watch that in real time. For me to make that graph in real time and when I'm not doing all that extra teaching would probably take me about 3.5 or 4 hours. And that just gets me to a point where I'm solid. I have all the hooks I need, and then I can make all the adjustments I want. So if you're interested in that, I'd appreciate if you head over to Patreon. You can support me there. It'd be great. If you can't do that, just subscribing to the channel is great. If you like the video, turn on the notification bell if you don't have it on would be really helpful as well. All that kind of typical YouTube trademark stuff would be really appreciated. But yeah, this one's fun. So let's hop into that. We're going to start with the basic graph and we'll work our way up through all the most interesting parts of the intermediate and advanced graphs. So let's get to the basic graph. All right, so we're sat here with the beginner graph open, and I would say this is very typical of student artwork I see right off the bat as they're getting a handle on Designer and learning it. It's still 108 nodes, which sounds like a lot, but you'd be surprised. It doesn't look it, but these things add up really quickly because a lot of the nodes you use in Designer are levels, transforms, blends, things like that you're going to have in triplicate, quadruplicate. They're just going to be everywhere. At this is okay. There's nothing wrong with it, and this, like I mentioned, is like very normal for what I see when people are just picking up Designer for the first time, or maybe, you know, a couple weeks in, couple months into learning. This is what stuff looks like. One of the big hallmarks of it, we'll talk about this as we go through the graph, is an over reliance on very, very small details at a very high frequency. So things like almost up to a white noise level of detail, right? So when we're talking about frequency and scales of detail, which we're going to be talking about a lot in this video, the scale refers to how big the shape is, and the frequency is how often the shape happens. So if you look at something like a Gaussian noise, and we have it just set on its standard scale, this is kind of medium scale. They're not big or small, each shape, and they're kind of medium frequency. Like they occur fairly frequent, but not enough to match a white noise, which is extremely high frequency, right? So you get spikes every other pixel is extremely different, and the shapes are as small as a pixel. So this is as noisy as it gets. Very low scale, very high frequency. Conversely, you can have shapes like a more zoomed out Gaussian noise, which is very large scale details that are low frequency. They don't occur very often. Typically, when people are starting out, I tend to notice that they focus a lot on really small details and really big details. So in this case, like the tiles themselves and the cracks, those are large details. And then the surfacing on the tiles in this case, but it could be anything, it could be wood, metal, whatever, as an over reliance on these really tiny detail, and everyone misses the kind of medium shapes, which add a lot more complexity to the material. Something else they also don't do is they don't make use of blends to break up what they're doing. So for example, when they're laying this noise on top, they don't use this mask slot to complicate the noise so that it's not just laid on at whatever percentage, 64%, on the entire sheet, instead of making it in some areas a bit stronger, in some areas a bit weaker, which adds a lot. And we'll get into that into the intermediate graph. So the height map at this point, if we use a normal map to just be able to see the details a bit better, edge damage like this is commonly in. That makes a lot of sense. This is a very simple setup. Just using a tile generator, edge detecting it, blurring it, using a bevel, setting it to auto level, and then it's just doing some quick damages with slope blurs. This is stuff that a lot of people do. The problem with the slope blurs and stuff here, which we'll get to in intermediate too, is that these noises cross the tile boundary. So you get this situation where the damage is very similar on either side of the tile. And that's true of all the detail being put into the height map. So if you look at even the Perlin noise, you can see this big raised area here, where there's this white bubble in the Gaussian noise that's being laid on top. It is larger here and here, right, on either side of the boundary, which doesn't make a lot of sense. If we look at our reference, it's not like a big detail that happens on this side of the texture should also happen on that side of the crack rather, right? There'd be two different types of damage. This is a perfect example. It's not like because this scoops in here that should scoop in on the other side, right? There are definitely types of damage that will cross the tile boundary, right? You can have cracks or, you know, but even here they don't line up perfectly, right? Like they've shattered in a different way. But a big thing people will do is just lay on damages, albedo textures, whatever, so that they actually cross that boundary. It's something we're going to fix in the intermediary graph, but it's very, very common. And then you can see we go from these like fairly large, low frequency shapes in the height map to all of a sudden a ton of noise. And people just tend to use the stock noises. Like they'll use dirt to black and white spots too, without doing any modifications to it, right? So they're just like, I don't have my library open, right? My node library, just because I'm used to it for the most part. But people will just go through that and find stuff they like the look of and just throw it on, which is not a bad way to learn. It gets you familiar with how the noises work. but I don't think it does a very good job of making your material more specific to your reference or for you learning cool tricks, right? And this is where stuff gets really gross, where you just lay on, you know, there's a little bit of work done here maybe. Like they've taken a black and white spots, blurred it, and then slope blurred it to inflate that noise. But this is very high frequency, very small detail. And it has the effect, especially notable about the beginning graph as well, is the noise is uniquely strong on everything. Or not uniquely, it is consistently strong across the whole tile, right? There's no area of any of these tiles that look different than any other area. Like all of these tiles look essentially identical because none of them have kind of a unique feature. And you want to be careful with that, as we'll talk about, we get into the other graphs. You need to be careful that you're not making details so unique that you can start to see the tiling much more obviously when you zoom out from the texture. The nice thing about the student work at this point is that they don't tile very obviously, but it's at the exchange, right? It's at the trade, the cost, I guess, of not having an interesting texture, right? So it's probably not worth it. You'd rather suffer a bit of that loss of obvious, or you'd rather have the tiling be a bit more obvious in exchange for having it look interesting most of the time, or at least I would. So that's the height map. They might have some slopes on stuff using flood fills. Like this does help. They're tilting the tile a little bit. But the height map is extremely simplified. If you get to the cracks, this is what basically all cracks look like on student artwork I see, which is just a very classic. They take a cells 4, they direction, like if I'm lucky and they're on top of it, they'll directionally warp this, right? So they're taking a directional warp and using some sort of texture to make the lines of the edge detect, or the lines of the cells 4 rather, not so perfect, right? To break them up a bit. Then they use an edge detect. It looks a lot worse if you don't have these, right? If you turn your directional warps off, then it's, I'd say, really bad, right? And again, these cracks just cross the tile boundary, right? Which feels odd. Again, there's damages that might be done after the tiles were laid, where maybe you could have damage spread from one tile to the next. But the individual damage on the tiles themselves, there's no real reason for them to be in the exact same spot. I have cracked tiles in my bathroom right now, slightly. And I can see these hairline cracks, and they don't line up, right? They are separate because the tile just cracked in different places. So if I'm lucky, they've done the due diligence of warping this, which is great. But this still doesn't look very good, right? It's the same width everywhere, like same line width. It doesn't match the damage that's on the edge of the tiles. It's just really boring. And then they're using some sort of flood fill to make sure that it's not on all the cracks or on all the tiles, right? This is a flood fill to random grayscale. And when they histogram scan this, they can decide to lower the amount of tiles that are cracked or increase the amount of tiles that are cracked. So that's not atypical for me to see at this level, right? Which is cool. Laying on the grout, right? So this is putting in our reference, we can see where there's broken tiles that we have a bit of grout exposed, like under here or in there, whatever, all this stuff, where they're laying down the mortar, right? Or grout. So that's not uncommon for people to pick up on. The way this is done is pretty cheap, right? Like this is just laid on, taking a moisture noise, and this histogram range, which I actually think this is actually uncommon, I think, to see at this level. But the nice thing about the range is that we have two controls here. One controls the contrast. So how much variance there can be in the black and white values of the input texture, which can make it have a bit more of an interesting blend where you get little bits that go above it. The lower I put the range, the more this is a solid color. So the blend is a little bit less interactive with the other layers. And then the position just makes the whole texture darker, whole texture brighter. So this effectively is like the amount of grout. But it's not great. It doesn't work really well, right? You'd rather improve on this. It's fairly boring. It could use some more work. It's also just, it's not going to wind up in the cracks, which feels kind of bad. And it doesn't show up in the way in the reference. The grout really shows, like there's a harsher transition because we have a broken tile and there's pieces missing physically. And that's where the grout is seen. which is not really how it works in this version of the project. It feels a lot worse because it's just kind of softly blending up the tile edge, which feels bad. It's like the tile is kind of goopy, right? So that's another common thing at this stage of people's like learning with Designer, is that the material interactions between the different layers, if you have like moss on rocks or rust on metal, they're pretty much just pasted over top of one another with, if you're lucky, a mask like this, right? They're not integrated in a way that makes physical sense based on the material you're referencing. So the grout could use a lot of work. Going up to the albedo texture, this is, in my opinion, one of the cardinal sins. Like, it's, if you're going to take away like one or two things from this video, this is one of them to not do. People will just, and I'm sure people will feel completely seen right now. They just take their height map, run it through a gradient map, right? And what they've done with that gradient map to get it, if you don't know what this node does, it just allows you to take an input. I almost don't want to teach people what this node does, but it takes an input grayscale texture, and then you can remap it to a gradient. So I'm just gonna, you won't be able to see me pick, but I can run this cursor all over my screen, and I can just sample colors from the screen. So I'll go to pick gradient, and I'll actually just pick this rainbow strip, right? And you remap that input grayscale to the colors you pick. You don't have to do it with the gradient either. You can just make individual nodes and pick colors you want. So I'm just picking some colors off of the 3D viewport in here, just picking random colors. So you can do that. The issue with doing this is I think everyone kind of learns this as a way to quickly get albedo going. The problem with it, in my opinion, you have very little control. When you go into that gradient map, interacting with this after the fact is really, I mean, it's impossible. If you're like, oh, I don't really like this one dark color, very annoying to remove it, right? Unless you do something after the fact, but even then it's a lot of headache. You don't have a lot of control as well. The way I got this was to use the pick gradient, right? So you're gonna be able to draw a line over whatever you want. And I drew a line over top of our color reference. So off screen, I'm gonna go to pick gradient and just run my cursor over this, which I think is, again, you feel seen. This is, I understand. It gets better, I promise. The issue with this is you can see these dark pieces. Where that's coming from is where I've ran the cursor over the grout, which isn't great, right? So I don't have a ton of control over the colors that get picked. I probably don't want these dark strips, but they're coming because that cursor is running over top of the grout, right? So it's a lot harder to control. It's really bad. So hard to control. The other bad thing is we're explicitly tying a piece of information from somewhere else in the graph with another piece of information, which you may or may not want. But in this case, you have no choice because the height map, this is information, right? That is representative of how tall or short your material is in those areas. The white areas are very high up. The black areas are very far down. Like the cracks are dark, right? The spaces in between the tile are dark. And then there are some tiles here that are tilted up from that flood fill, and they're whiter at the top. They're taller. Because the gradient map is taking the grayscale values and remapping them to this new range, all of the cracks will be whatever color happened to be ran over black, right? All of the top parts will be whatever color was ran over at white, which you may or may not want. You might want the cracks to be brighter because there's like a white grout, or you may want the edges of the tile to be darker because there's a grunge in there, but too bad you grabbed a brighter value, right? So it gives you no control, and you're making a decision to tie color information to height information. In some cases that might work, right? There might be some materials you observe and you're like, hey, the taller this material gets, the more saturated it gets, the more blue it gets. Okay, perfect. Then you can do that. But I'd like to be able to make that decision proactively when it's something I want, instead of just being like, I don't know, we'll see what happens. We'll play the gradient random, the pick gradient slot machine, and we'll just see what happens. Right? This is picking from the same texture, but I got a completely different result. It's just a slot machine. So you don't want to do this, in my opinion, and it's something I see all of the time. This is essentially in 90% of the student graphs I see. I made a little bit of adjustments to here to change the color a little. Maybe if I'm lucky, students are doing things like blurring it so that it's not so noisy. Let's look at just these one at a time into the albedo instead of seeing everything all at once. So there's very little work generally done to the albedo here, right? To just get the basics of this stone surface on. It doesn't look great. And I'm going to undo that color pick. There you go. We'll run this through again. The next detail, if this is this next section here, I'm super lucky if I see this. Often, this will just be their albedo. And we're done. It cooked, I'd say. But if I'm really, really lucky, they've made some deliberate color choices. Right? So they've gone into the reference, they've done an observation, right, which is really important. Half of making any art is just looking at stuff. And they've noticed, oh, there's sort of this like orangey, kind of reddish, cloudy noise here somewhere. It's kind of pinkish. So they pick that explicitly. Like they make the decision, hey, I'm going to go sample that color specifically. And then they make a noise for it and they blend it over top. So really, and they do it again, they find like there's a darker brown that's got these smaller stains. Cool. That's all good. Doing some actual work. This is what I'd say is what making an actual albedo texture feels like. Making observations from your reference and then replicating that noise, the shape of that noise, the frequency of that noise, what color it should be, and rebuilding it. That's what making an albedo texture ought to be. It's not similar from making a height texture. You're looking at a thing and like, how do we rebuild it? This is only 8 nodes worth of the graph goes into doing this. It's very light. So it doesn't work super, super well. Moving on to the pattern, this is where stuff gets extremely sketchy. So I think people see this type of thing, right? We want to put this pattern on top of our tiles, and they get really intimidated with how to do that. So what they do instead is they just don't. Sometimes it's just easier to not do it. So they actually import the texture specifically. They go into something like Photoshop. If I'm lucky, again, they've gone in and done levels in Photoshop, tried to separate out parts of the mask. You can do it in here as well, but often they don't. They just cut out the part they want, bring it in, and they just tile it around, right? So I decided on all of the graphs that I wanted the pattern to tile across 4 tiles instead of being each tile having 1, because I just felt it was a little too noisy, right? So if I have it at the number of tiles there actually are, I just felt like this was a little too noisy. It's personal taste though. I just wanted it to be happening across 4 tiles. And that way the tiles all look a little different too. So they'll tile generate this, whatever, or I'm lucky if they use a tile generator. Again, sometimes they'll just zoom out from it, right? They'll just do this. I find this much more hard to control for sure. And then they're like, okay, how do I lay this on? And all they really do is turn this into a grayscale using a grayscale conversion node here. And then they scan that to just try to get the mask of where it is. And then lay it right on over top. Right? So this is, if you've seen yourself doing this before, my condolences, right? This is not a really great way of doing it. It's okay. The real problem here, getting this, there's some breakup on it. I guess it's kind of nice that we don't get such a perfect mask, but I would rather have a perfect mask of where the patterns are and then apply my own damage afterwards, right? So I have a lot more control and I can make decisions. Right now, I'm just stuck with whatever this noise looks like. It's also the case that the noise is identical on every tile, right? These little 2 specks that are in the center of the star pattern, they occur on every single tile because it's just based on 1 image, right? So there's a lot of downsides to this. It doesn't look as, we don't have as much variety as we could have, for sure. It's much harder to control the mask, and we don't really have an ability to make specific decisions over what that damage should look like. And then controlling the color is a nightmare, right? Because here, I have to just sort of change the hue. If I'm like, okay, I want to make the center darker, sure, but now these get darker as well, right? If I want the rose pattern in the middle to be bright, good luck, right? Like I'm basically unable to do it. I need these as separate layers. I want the star, these like big spokes, to be separate from this star, to be separate from these triangle points, to be separate from these kind of edges. But right now I don't have that choice, right? So I'm just stuck with whatever. I basically match this one, and the other ones are just whatever they're going to be, right? So it feels really bad. I can't pick the colors I actually want, but it's easy. So this is what people redound to often. The grout, it's just a color blended on top. It's very normal for me to see too. And then the things like the ambient occlusion and curvature are generally used in a way that's too strong, particularly curvature. People will just lay this on really, really, really intense. And I think people just like the look of this, especially if they've been looking at a lot of sort of more stylized materials or whatever. And there's a lot more highlighting along the edges. People just tend to be very heavy-handed with this, right? And I've struggled with that too when I was learning, that I just wanted, you want that pop, right? People like that contrast. So really dark, not really shadows, but like tight areas here where there's ambient occlusion. And the highlight, they want a big punch, right? So there's a real difference in value between the two. But it ends up being really, everything ends up looking the same in like rock. In this case, we're making rock, so that's fine. But a lot of students' work, whether it's wood or metal or whatever, it all kind of ends up looking like damaged rock because they go really overboard with these finisher textures, right? Like the curvature in the AO. If I'm lucky, they're using a color for their AO to actually use it as an opportunity to blend in a new color. So the AO is being used as a mask in this blend to lay on a color. It's not uncommon for me to instead see this. They take their AO, they put it over top, and they just multiply it, right? They just multiply black down into the texture, which is a lot less interesting. You're giving up an opportunity to introduce a new color. It can be a problem, I think, right? Like this is much more nice. I'm lucky if I see this, right? So this is a simple step you can do to improve the quality of that. That's really it for the albedo. There's not a ton of nodes here. I forget what it was when I counted, but it's like, 23, 24. There's not a lot of things here. The roughness map is even worse. And this is another really common thing, which is take the albedo, convert it into grayscale. If I'm lucky, again, they're making some adjustments to it with levels or histograms or whatever. Maybe they're putting the AO onto it. This is awful. Don't be like this. This is very similar to the albedo. What you're doing is you're taking a piece of information from somewhere else to color and turning it into roughness. I understand why people do this. It's an old school thing. I've seen it done like all the time. The issue here is just because a color is dark doesn't mean it should be smooth, right? Because remember, darkness in the roughness map indicates smoothness, right? How smooth the surface is, how shiny it will be, and how white something is how rough it'll be or how matte the surface will be. Like it won't be shiny. If we're just using the albedo texture to control that, we're just stuck. Like the cracks are gonna have to be smooth. They're gonna be wet. And I toned it down a little bit. But if you look at this, the cracks of this texture are smooth. They're a lot shinier. I put the AO over top of it, which helped. But the cracks are actually wet. And the grout often is wet here. And the only reason it is because the albedo is dark there. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Like you could have dark grout that is rough. It's grout. It's made out of stone. It should be rough. It's like sandpaper. It's really gritty. The pattern, maybe I want the pattern to be rougher where there's that paint, but like I just have to make it smooth now. I don't have a choice. So it's very similar to the height being turned into color, turning the color into roughness. Sure, it does give you a bunch of interest, right? Which is kind of fake. It's not very earned in the roughness map, but I can't control it. And you always want to have control for that. So those two things are probably the albedo and the roughness map. These are probably the most indicative stuff of this sort of first level of materials I see. It's not laziness. I think it's just people don't know how to approach those things. They don't know how to approach making the albedo. They don't know how to approach making the roughness map. So they just use information. Most people can kind of figure out the height map, but then they just use that to make everything else. And I think that that tends to be a bit of a problem. You don't have any control, and you're kind of stuck with whatever decisions you made earlier. All right, intermediate. So stuff starts to feel a lot better here. This is a big jump up from the previous material. This is what I'll see sort of, at the end of a 14-week teaching period, or, a couple months. People are actually starting to get the hang of it and they're feeling a bit better. Things are a lot more integrated. The albedo is feeling a little bit more interesting. Blends are used a bit more effectively. The material just generally sits better. There's a lot more better decisions, but a lot of better decisions are being made. I still think that there's an over-reliance on small and big details and ignoring that kind of middle frequency of scale and frequency. It's still not there, really. But there's a lot more deliberate decision-making being made, right? You still get this feeling that the noises are fairly stacked on top of one another. And I can kind of see the individual noises in layers, right? They're not integrated with as well as they possibly could be, but it's a lot better than the previous one from the beginner level. This one is 329 nodes. So it's 3 times as much as the previous. Almost exactly 3 times as much. So it's just to show you how that complexity sort of scales up, right? It's a lot more to go to the next level. You're not doubling the amount of nodes, you're tripling them. So things get complicated pretty quickly. But let's walk through some of the specific kind of points of interest here. A lot of stuff is fairly similar to the previous graph in the height. But here's already a big departure and a cool trick. Instead of just using this noise as the slope blur, before that's gone on, a directional warp is used to break that noise apart per tile. And this is great because we have very different values in this map on either side of this tile boundary. And that makes our edge damage a lot more reliably different. Like this area is not even damaged at all. And then we have damage on the other side, right? A lot more interest, a lot more variety. It's just more believable. That's happening all the time, right? It's happening here as well for that second slope blur. And eventually, we're at this point in this surfacing where some actual, in the previous graph, we just had a Gaussian noise laid on over top of this. Right? So if we look at what this normal map looks like, put the strength up so you can see that detail better. The surface is a lot more varied up. So instead of just having a Gaussian noise over top of everything, which made the tiles just look kind of generally lumpy, now this noise is a lot more interesting. We have some more flat areas. There's some more, there's different shapes happening here, different directions. And the way this is working is just taking some noises. Again, if you go to the Patreon, right, you can watch the entire high level graph being made so you can see it step by step. But just to give you an idea, there's a lot more interest here. There's multiple Gaussian noises being blended together to get different frequencies and scales of detail. So there's attempts to get that sort of medium range in, which is great. And then it's got a directional warp on it, a slope blur. So this noise is already a lot more custom and it's based off of observations made in the actual reference. This directional warp that we did on earlier on the slope blurs, but is also happening here, is really key. So to explain why this is so important, right now you'll see that the surfaces of this normal map don't cross the tile boundaries. These directional warps allow us to break that up. If we didn't have this, the noise would just get laid right on top of everything, right? This shape just continues on to that other tile, which makes no sense. You want to get away from that look, which happens a lot in the beginning, like kind of level 1 graph, where people take a noise and just stamp it on top of stuff. There's a place near where I live where they have these bricks on the ground, but what the bricks are is they just clearly lay a red concrete and then they have like a big metal stamp. That's the like seams of the bricks and they just stamp it in while it's wet. But because you can see noise and brick detail cross from one tile to the next and it looks fake because it is. It's not a real separate object. The way this directional warp is working to do this for us is you have this just warps the texture in a certain direction at a certain intensity but it has an intensity input, unlike the normal warp. So if you put just a grayscale value in this basically just says, hey, don't warp at all. This is black. Warp at your full strength if this is 1. And warp at half strength if you're 0.5. If you put a texture into this instead of just a color, you get a variety of different. And if we say, hey, warp to the left at like a really high intensity, you can see that the top of the texture is moving to the left and the bottom isn't moving at all. Because at the bottom of the gradient, we have black and at the top we have white. So it allows us to basically mask out where the warping is happening. And if we give that directional warp a bunch of different intensities that are unique, not unique, but they're different on every tile. We did that with our flood fill. Right, so we have a flood fill to random grayscale. I have a whole video on flood fills. I think it's the most popular video on the channel, actually, for some reason. I'm not sure. But you can check that out if you don't understand the flood fills, because I think it's really sort of valuable to learn. We distance that. We use a directional warp here. And because that directional warp has a different grayscale value on each tile, they all move at different amounts, right? So different tiles warp different distances. And since they're all next to each other but moving different distances, it tears the noise apart, right? So this is a really kind of key teachable moment in here that I think is really important. This is like a very important technique to understand, but it does a ton to create more believability in our services. Again, there's some more. This was decided to go over the tile boundaries, so that's okay. But you can see we kind of jump. There's not a lot of interesting blends between these noises because all these blend maps are still not used. Right, we'll discuss that in sort of the advanced graph. But it still just feels like this is just kind of pasted on top of everything. Right? If we look at the normal map, we can see where it doesn't kind of blend in and out, like have areas where it's a really hard transition, areas where it's soft. It's just there. It's still nice. Like at the end of the day, after all of this surfacing is added on, it does tend to feel a lot better because we're making direct observations from the height map. I still believe at this case that there's an over-reliance on noise, right? On just throwing a lot of crunch at stuff. A lot of stuff I see from students just generally I would describe as crunchy, right? It feels like there's a lot of like really gritty noise everywhere. And I think that there's a lot of room for improvement there, but this is like considerably better. The cracks here are far more interesting than they used to be. It's still not great, but this is much, much better. Right, the cracks feel way more interesting. We're gonna make a whole video on cracks, like, and again, if we'll get to it in the advanced. But at this point, instead of using a stock Voronoi noise, right, which is the cells 3 or 2, I don't even know, cells 4. Instead of using this, because the issue with the cells 4 is that it's very even, right? The cells are all just about the same size. So I also have a video on this, making like a custom Voronoi. That's what we did here. We scattered all of these dots everywhere using a tile sampler and masked them out so they don't show up in the dark areas of this texture. When we distance those, we get areas where the cells are way bigger than others. So they're really small up here, where there's a lot of dots up here. There's not as much room for these to grow into each other to create smaller cells, but there's a lot more room for these to expand. So here we get bigger cells and here we get smaller ones. And that goes a long way to making that feel more natural because we don't have basically the same size cells everywhere. There's a lot more variety. And people are doing stuff at this point, like using warps. So this has the added benefit of like thickening up certain parts of the line and thinning out others, especially if you stack a couple of them one after the other. There's just some more directional warps. And then we're doing stuff like actually beveling it, auto leveling it, and now using that directional warp to separate the cracks so that they appear in different parts, right? Those cracks no longer cross the tile boundary, which is really important. So these look, and then there's even some slope blur on the cracks to break up the perfectness of it, right? So if you see here, this is a lot more interesting. If we turn the slope blur off, it's a really low intensity. If we turn this off, we're back to having these like very just straight lines. The slope blur does a ton to just make it feel, again, I've used the word a lot, but more integrated with that base layer, right? It's much more tied in, and it just feels more connected to the material itself. But the cracks are a massive improvement at this level. And this is not uncommon that I'll see this at this level, where they have this kind of like added layer of attention. Something of note here that I think is really smart to do is, instead of focusing on, okay, I only want cracks on certain tiles and which tiles should those be on, how I would go about building this, and even when I was at this level, this is how I would think about this. I'm just focusing on applying cracks to the entire texture, right? They're just being blended on everywhere. And what I'll do at the end of the day is decide I will blend on our full crack texture where every tile is cracked, with our version where none of the tiles are cracked, and just blend between them here. So you'll see if you look through the graph, there's all these portal nodes, right? Which are just referencing other parts of the graph. This is the tile heights before we did the cracks. That's what this guy's sending the portal node off to. And then this is the fully cracked texture. And we're just blending between those two with a flood fill to random grayscale, and then histogram scanning it. Right, so we have one place where we can control, hey, how many tiles should be cracked? Right, I can turn this way up to make the tile floor much more damaged, or tone it down. Right, there's it's very easy to tune. Too often, people are doing multiples of these within this, blending things over one at a time using different masks. And I would rather go, here's thing A, the tiles that have no cracks. Here's thing B, everyone is cracked. And then we blend between them with a mask. That's much simpler. It's a much more clean way to organize it so that you're able to tune things much easier. But these generally are much better. We're also deciding to literally chunk out certain versions of these tiles, like get rid of them. So again, it's just more attention to the reference, right? Noticing that, hey, there's actually pieces of this tile missing, right? And having those missing makes the grout blending a lot more interesting, because it makes sense. You'd see the grout because like a piece of the tile is actually gone. So the way this was done was to make a normal map of our cracks, turn it into a curvature map, histogram scan it just to get the centers of them. And then it got blended over with the tile borders themselves. And when that's used in a flood fill, we get a little ID for every cell, not just every tile, but every individual segment of tile, the broken ones. If we use a flood fill to random grayscale and histogram scan that, we can decide to just actually grab certain chunks of them. Like I could turn this up way more to remove way more chunks, or less, if I don't want it to be very common. So this adds a ton, right? Makes it a lot more believable. We actually have these pieces that are missing. Makes a big difference. So the cracks in general, you'll notice they make up a huge percentage of the total nodes in the graph, right? Because they're a lot more care has gone into the way that they blend and interact with each other. The grout is also got a lot more detail in it now. Instead of just being a moisture noise, we've made a direct observation from the graph, right? So again, people at this level, I think, are more often actually using their reference, right? Looking at it and going, well, what does it look like? And let's just rebuild that. It sounds kind of 4-head, right? 5-head, but people generally avoid doing that. They want to kind of just screw around and go, they look at the reference and go, oh, there's grout. And then they go over to their other monitor and they just make what they think grout should look like. But just look at it, right? You have it right there. Just rebuild it. Not enough people spend time looking. But I noticed there's these sort of lines here, and it got me interested. Like, well, why are there lines? And the reasons there's lines is because when you lay the grout down, you use a tool that's got kind of these teeth in it to take half of the grout out, right? So there's these lines of it. So when you place the tile on it and squeeze the tile down, you don't get grout like out the cracks of the tile, because when you push down, it just spreads into each other instead of spreading up and out the tile, right? So adding stuff like that it helps the material feel more believable because you're making something the way it actually would be made in the real world, right? And you're learning a bit about the world around you, which is always cool as well. So that's what these lines are. And I thought at this point, let's replicate that. So just got a tile generator, made some lines, like pretty simple. And we're just scattering it into each tile using a flood fill to map or grayscale. Which again, if you want to watch that flood fill video, we explain what all these guys do. Or if you watch the Patreon video of the full remake of the advanced graph, you will also see step-by-step my decisions through all of these. But this gets added onto the grout, screened on, technically. And that becomes a lot more interesting, right? The grout is way more varied, detailed than the original basic grout. Still some adjustments you would want to make, but it's a big improvement. Speaking of big improvements, moving on to Albedo, things get much smarter here. So still using a gradient map in a way I'm not totally stoked about, right? Just hitting the gradient editor, going to pick gradient and then pick gradient and then running it all over our reference. It's fine, but we're a little bit more selective this time. And the reason it's a bit more selective is because we're using a flood filter random grayscale, a distance. So this is every tile. And we're using that as our grayscale input instead of a bunch of noise, like the height map was, right? And this gets a lot more selective with the colors, right? So they're all kind of related to each other. And I don't have wildly different colors from node to node. They all already feel like they belong with one another, right? Which it feels a lot better. I can also blur these to even decrease that even more, to make them more similar and take variation out. Because I'm sending this sampled color to a bunch of other positions in the albedo texture. So this was just getting like kind of a color per tile, right? Because if you look at the reference, each tile is a slightly different tone. And we sort of accomplished that here with that color sample. There is a much better attempt here to try to make interesting albedo choices based on viewing the reference. So we're just going to look at these one at a time. This is way better, right? Just creating this initial medium shapes, right? Which is good. We're not just focusing on just high frequency and low frequency. And the important thing to notice here is we're using the height map to ultimately drive gradient maps. But instead of just plugging the height directly into this, we're making a much more interesting noise. And all this noise really is like taking a moisture noise and a cloud, we blended them together. And I'm using that to make the height map even more detailed than it was originally. We're directionally warping it, so it's different per tile, auto leveling it. So we're still using the height map to influence the color, but we're using it in an indirect way. We're not just piping the height map directly into the gradient map and saying, cool, we're good. We're taking it and manipulating it a bunch so that when we run it through the gradient map, we're getting something that's quite divorced from the height map, right? The tallest parts are not always going to be blue. The darkest parts are not always going to be green, right? There's a variety there. And the color is coming from that sampled color we built. So we have a lot more control over what this looks like. If we wanted to, we could put like an HSL. If we just decided we want this to be more blue, we could take a level, grab the blue channel, and just pump it up. And this noise would become a lot more blue. Just this noise. Right, so we have the ability to tune this to a much more specific degree. And these are basically all the same thing. You'll see this a lot. This and this and this are essentially the same thing, just getting different areas of the gradient, warping them differently. Right, they're all slightly different noises. But we end up getting a lot more specific with the detail we put on. And we can see these slowly getting added on top of one another. You can see here I actually did decide to, hey, let's pump up the green on this noise. But at this point, things are starting to feel a lot more deliberate. I still think it's an over focus on high frequency, right? We sort of lose it by the end here. It's harder to see these medium shapes, but it's a lot better. This is a huge improvement, right? These tiles look pretty good. Moving on through here, here's another really fun thing. In the reference, you can sort of see these like really bright little scratches. These kind of cracks in the tile. I don't know what it is. It must, maybe when they glaze them, they crack in this interesting way. They probably put something in the glaze, if I had to guess. That like when fired in a kiln, it creates this kind of crackle pattern. But it's really cool. And here we decided, well, why don't we just rebuild that? Now, we didn't really do a great job. We're using one of the designer stock nodes, which is fine. This directional scratches node. Scanning it, warping it so that it doesn't carry over per tile, right? So same trick we did earlier. And then it's just getting added on top. So it's just a good example of an observation we made from the reference that we just decided to rebuild in the albedo, right? So starting to see more of that at this level is really kind of a telltale sign of it. Putting in these little black specks, right? Just trying to create it. This isn't great, but this is still something I'll see at this level. The pattern is interesting. So at this point in the pattern, we have decided to build the pattern completely procedurally within Substance Designer. So the pattern was reconstructed in here from scratch. And what's great about that is we have individual tuning over the different layers. So I can go in and say, you know what, that green, it should be brighter. Cool, and it's now separate from the others, right? And our masks are perfectly clean. So they come in totally perfect. And we can manipulate these one by one. The color IDs are so that I have the separate masks, right? So I have a mask for the green layer. I have a mask for the little triangles and a little mask for the centers. And they're all editable separately from each other, right? So these seem scary. Going through the process of building these is a really good way to just learn a lot. You learn a lot more about Substance Designer. For sure. Like you pick up a lot of interesting skills along the way, but it's a huge advantage, right? It's really important. So you can see where we generated this is we actually built a separate little graph here, and its whole job is to build the pattern. This is the pebble. We go to the pattern generator. All this thing does is build this pattern for us. It's a little simple graph that builds us for it. I'm going to make, if you go over to Patreon, you can see me making the high level graph where I walk through this from scratch because you see me build the whole graph in real time. So if you're interested, you can go check that out. We can give a brief overview here. I'm also probably going to make a video dedicated to pattern making like this because I think it's something people in the Discord ask about it a lot. And I think this is something that is worth doing a big video on. But a lot of what's going on here is splatter circular. Probably what the coolest trick here is, so we'll show that off now, is when thinking about making this, I think too many people focus on, well, I got to make these bar shapes first, and then I have to make these triangles, and then there's this little red star, and then you have this line. They see them as separate things, particularly in here. And I actually see this as one thing, right? Here's the one cool trick we'll show off with the patterns. But again, if you want the full thing, head over to Patreon. Appreciate the support. And again, there will be a video coming up where I'm sure we'll do like patterns and like we'll do a lot of pattern stuff. What's interesting about this is I actually don't see these as, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 different shapes. I actually just see 4. So, and this is just, some of this is just learning how to, making a lot of this stuff, right? And just learning kind of interesting techniques. But if you think about it, there's really just these bars. So if you picture just the green shape as if it continues through here, there's just 4 of them, right? Because this is the same, this is the same, this is the same. And really these shapes, this happens a lot in these kind of geometric patterns, right? These white triangles are made where 2 of these bars intersect, right? So this becomes white where these 2 shapes like cross over each other. And then the red shape happens when more than 2 cross over, where they all cross over. So to make that shape, all I did was make that initial kind of green bar, right? The long green bar here. And the way I did that was just get a shape, use a directional warp with a gradient, right? So this is just like using our, what we were doing to separate our noises out per tile. But I'm warping it up much stronger in the middle and much less at the sides. So it creates this sort of like chevron shape. And then I mirrored it with a mirror grayscale node. Because I don't want it to like push in at the bottom and up at the top. I want them both to push like in and out. And this is the cool trick here. I used a splatter circular. So this is a tile generator where everything, we're going to do a whole video on splatter circular at some point too, because it's really cool. But made a pattern input, set it to the 8 we needed. And I just set the radius to 0 so that they start right in their middle. And I scaled these up a bunch. So all the settings on this should feel very similar if you've used any kind of tile generator. Right, we set this way higher. Shrink them down. Cool. How we need to get them to intersect with each other now. So I went down to the color and turned on luminance by pattern number. So this just makes the ones that were rendered first darker, and they slowly get brighter as they're rendered one on top of each other. So this is actually, I mean, you could edge detect this, and this is sort of interesting, right? It's already kind of a cool shape. It's kind of fun. So you can use the splatter circular to make a lot of really fun things. But what we're going to do here is we're using the max blending mode by default. So the brighter of the two values get stacked on top of one another. Or the brighter gets stacked on top of the darker value, right? So this one feels like it's on top of this one feels like it's on top of this one, so on and so forth. If we switch this to add instead, when they overlap the values, instead of saying, hey, which one of you is brighter, I'll go over top, they just get added together and become much brighter. Now, these values to begin with were quite bright, right? If we switch back to max. So if we add this to this, we're going to go over 1. We're going to get just white. If we add this to this, we're going to go over 1. We're getting just white. So it doesn't work at first, but if we go down, if we go up rather to the top and we turn the initial color of the patterns down, you see what I mean? And these start to intersect, right? So they're really dark now. If I switch back to max, they're very dark, but if these all get added to each other, we get the intersections. And ultimately what I did down the graph is really just edge detect this. And this is our pattern, right? This is the pattern we were building. I can't really put that somewhere you guys will be able to see it like that. And I can make some adjustments. Like I would want to go to here and probably scale these up. But the nice thing about building this in Designer, we have a lot more control of the end pattern. And it's very easy to change it, right? If we want to make like a Tool album cover right away. That's really what this node is very good at, making Tool album covers, basically. But you can do a lot of really, really fun stuff with this using that splatter circular. So that's the real key in here to understand. And the big thing really is that making that pattern in Designer itself just gives us a ton of flexibility to be able to change those colors separately as we're going, right? It's a huge benefit. And we're able to make that mask for the clouds. So we're doing a very similar thing to the height map. We're taking a version of the tiles where the pattern is on everything and a version where it's not on at all, and blending between them with this mask so that the pattern isn't as strong in every area, right? So it looks a little damaged, and we have a lot more control over this damage. We can decide, hey, I don't want it to kind of have a soft blend. I want it to be either there or not, right? So it feels a lot more like kind of like a decal now, I guess, right? Or like a sticker. It doesn't feel like it got rubbed off. It like got peeled off. So building this ourselves, it seems arduous, right? It seems like it's a lot to do, but it gives us way more control over the individual elements, like the different colors. We can decide, hey, let's make my favorite colors. Let's go like a mint and a really like strong magenta and like a deep purple down here. right? You can really quickly change. Now, obviously, I like it, but I always like this. You have a lot more, the point is, you have a lot more control over these at this point, right? And you have a lot more flexibility to just change this. So setting these up, I think, is definitely worth it. Going through here, these feel a lot better now. We're adding in some specific noises to do grunge, right? More things noticing directly from the albedo texture. And the curvature is beginning to be a bit more interesting too. I still think at this level, people are making it too strong. The reason this is more interesting now is because there's just more information in the height map to begin with. So stuff just feels like it's got more to it. But I still think that it's too strong, right? It comes on way too intense. I don't think that it's worth doing it in this way, because you do get that look again of just these corners are way too bright. People are kind of distracted by wanting to have that punch between the edge and the cracks there. But these feel generally a lot better than they did in the base texture, right? A lot better. Later on, like we're using these grunge maps, we're in the advanced level. Instead of using, there's nothing wrong with using these, right? This is just one of the stock designer grunge generators. I think it's good when you're learning to use these just to see what you like, but ultimately you want to build these noises yourself, which we do in the advanced graph. Because again, I've seen a lot of this grunge map. I'll see people's materials, spheres or whatever on ArtStation or whatever it is, and I go, I can see these in particular, right? So I think you want to get used to, you're going to get better by just building your own, right? You're going to learn a ton, and it's not hard to do, and it customizes your material, and it allows you to make specific observations from the reference and build them back, which I think is really important. So that's it for the albedo. It's generally much, much better. At this point, roughness map, huge improvement. So people at this point are like, you know what? I'm not going to just turn my albedo into roughness. I'm going to go a little bit further than that. So instead, they're like, let's build this out piece by piece, right? Let's actually like take the time. I'm just going to skip which node we're looking at for roughness. They're like, hey, let's like just make, this is completely divorced from the albedo. The color doesn't affect it at all, right? This is just kind of an initial layer of interest to break up the roughness response. You can see it on the glancing angles here. And it's just adding some general noise. And importantly, what's going on now is people are pulling individual details from the albedo texture. So this is something you'll see me do in a lot of the Patreon tutorials, a lot of the full-length tutorials. I do this a lot. I'm using a portal node here to grab individual parts of the albedo texture. So for example, this specific grunge where everything got a bit brighter, I'll make it really intense for a second, right? Just brightened up these areas, these bright splotches. I said, you know what? I think I'll want this to be affected in the roughness map. Like maybe those bright areas, they're more buffed out, right? Because that's where people have like broken the material with their foot, or they've just rubbed it over time as they've walked across it, and it's created more new material exposed, and it's rougher, right? There's no shine on it anymore. Like the glaze has been buffed out. So I just take that texture and put it in the red channel of an RGBA merge. This is just so that I can send a bunch of these textures somewhere else in the graph as one package. So I don't have noodles flying all over the place, a bunch of wires all over the place. This was our scratches we built, those white scratches, because I thought maybe those should get shinier or duller. And then the alpha texture were those little spots. And I make a portal node. So again, the way you make those is just you make a dot node and you name it whatever you want. And then when you make another dot node, that will be pickable from the list. And that just sends information across the graph. So I take these specific details, induce stuff with them, like screen in that buffed out area so it gets brighter there. I subtract those scratches actually, so they get darker. So you can see, it's hard to tell, but in those little scratches get a lot more smooth. I'm still not using masks at this point, which I should be, but we'll get to that. But this does a lot to just, again, we're basically rebuilding the roughness map from scratch, right? We're taking the patterns and we're saying, let's make the patterns be a bit smoother, as if there's like some paint involved, and it could have been way stronger, right? You can make them look like really wet paint. But you can see the advantage over the basic graph, right? Now we're able to actually decide, hey, I think the pattern should actually be a lot smoother or a lot rougher. They shouldn't be as shiny. Or maybe they should be a bit shinier, but not that much, right? We're able to control all of these separate elements independently of one another. So there's a lot more improvement here, right? You can see how different this looks from the albedo. It's not like everywhere we have dark values, we get smoother, and everywhere we have bright values, we get rougher. It's a lot more hand built, and it's based on observations of previous reference. And we're mixing in different elements from the graph as we want, right? We're not just piping them into each other and hoping for the best, right? Hitting the roughness slaughtering machine, right? We're able to just, or slot machine, I guess. Instead, we're able to just pick the elements we want and decide what to do with them as we go. So it's a huge improvement. Like I mentioned, this is where stuff kind of looks like at kind of after 14 weeks of teaching. There's a lot more to go, which we will get to next. And finally, we get to our last one, right? So this is the advanced graph. And like I mentioned, if you want to go to Patreon and subscribe, I'd appreciate it. And you could see me rebuild this graph completely from scratch, right, in real time. This took me 7 hours to build, right? So the tutorial, 7 hours. And it's a bit slower than I would normally go if I was just working on personal work, because I have to explain a bunch of stuff along the way, right? So for me, this is probably 4 hours of work, 4.5 hours of work. So even at like an advanced state, like I can do much better than this personally. But what I mean by this state is for me, this is essentially a very good jump off point. I have all of the hooks and controls I need to be able to tune this. I probably need another, 4 hours, 6 hours to tune everything, get everything sitting exactly how I want it, make little micro adjustments and bring it to that really high level of polish that I kind of expect from myself, and just try to push myself to get better than I am, right? Because you're always improving. But this graph is ballooned up to 657 nodes, right? So this is 6 times as much as the basic, and it's 2 times as much as the advanced, and 6 times as much as the basic. Almost exactly, weirdly. I don't know how that happened, but it just goes to show you how much more complexity goes into trying to get that complexity visually out of your graph. So, like I mentioned, 7 hours for me while I'm teaching it. If you want that full tutorial, you can head over to Patreon. For me, normally, 4-ish hours. If it takes you a bit longer to get there when you're starting, that makes perfect sense, right? But things are getting a lot better here. Interaction between surfaces is much more nice. It's a lot more interesting, a lot more of a complex blend happening. The material interactions are much better. Where grout is interacting with the material, we actually get it like bunched up in the middles, right? So when I learned, right, that when the tiles get pressed, the grout kind of squishes up. So I wanted to imitate that here. So the grout comes up. We still have the missing sections. I also have like little pebbles in the grout, right, which are just like pieces of the grout that have snapped off of other places. So it's a lot more complete. The curvature is no longer just like this huge eyesore. It's a little bit more integrated right along the edges. Things are just sitting a lot nicer. So let's walk through some of these like big major changes. For one thing, the height map, we finally are at a point where I think we're adding enough kind of medium scale detail that we avoid that kind of look of just really, really noisy textures. This stuff is still the same. The big difference that we get from going from the intermediate graph to the advanced is I'm making extensive use of masks here to break up when I'm blending on different details. So in the past, right, if you look at this, this is what this would have looked like in the intermediate graph. If I turn the intensity up here and I take the mask off here, you can see the noise just kind of goes on the same intensity everywhere. Every tile has the same amount of noise, or the same intensity of noise, right? But even just taking something like a flood filter random grayscale here and making it so that it's not as strong on all the tiles. On some it's very strong, where there was a white tile or relatively bright tile. And on a dark tile, it's relatively flat still, right? So there's a lot the noise is kind of easing out of each other. It's not just stamped on top of one another over and over. We get this sort of interesting interaction between the layers. And you'll see that's what helps, that's what's contributing to the ballooning of the node count, is there's a lot more things like that. Same thing here, when I was laying on this noise, right, this kind of layered noise. In the past graph, it was just this. But I decided to take that noise, duplicate it, blur it, auto level it, and just level it a little bit more. And I put that into a non-uniform blur. And so that allows me to blur some areas of the texture and others won't. But that just creates a lot more variety in how this ultimately looks. Because some areas of this texture are quite soft and kind of blend into the background. And some areas are quite hard transition. Right? This is a perfect example. We have very hard transitions over here and very soft right there. So we get these really interesting bits of variety where the noise sort of like fades in and out. And obviously you want to look at your reference and try to duplicate what's going on in the reference. But especially if you have scan data, really helps. So you can see a normal map. But this makes things a lot more interesting. I'm also using it as a mask. Right? So it's not being put on at full intensity everywhere. This is immediately a lot better. And you'll notice that with all of these noises, that instead of just laying them on flat over top, I'm manipulating them in some way, and I'm using a mask so that those noises kind of fade in and out. Right? There's a lot less reliance on those like really high frequency details. And we're being really deliberate about our choices as we slowly build up to the high frequencies like this. And even then, in our high frequencies here, I have a lot of variety, right? Instead of just laying over a dirt, right, which is what you'd see in like a basic graph for sure. I've taken it, used a non-uniform blur. So some areas are really sharp. Some areas are a lot softer, right? Like these high frequency noises are very different from this. We get this really sharp spike there, but over here we get just like a little soft pit. But they're the same noise at the beginning, but we do some manipulation to them to make them feel a little bit more natural. And again, a mask to blend between them. That's a big, huge part of it. Another thing to note is I've actually replaced all of our directional warps with vector warps. So it's a little bit more of a weird node, but the reason why I want to do this is generally I get a lot more variety out of them. So it's a cool moment here. Remember that this is what our how our directional warp was working. We would get a flood filter random grayscale and use a distance node to just get rid of that black in the middle, right? We want to get rid of this crack, the seam between the shapes. So we use a distance node. And this is how we were separating the noises in the other graph. Right, so each noise gets a different intensity. So how far, or each cell gets a different intensity for how far it should warp based on this grayscale texture. But they're all moving in the same direction. And that's okay. But the thing about it is this part of the noise here, for instance, can never show up over here. Because it's all being directionally warped in this direction, this kind of diagonal direction. They can't shuffle around to other parts of the texture, which I think will feel nicer. We get more variety, right? You're just part of the move from intermediate to advanced is just looking for opportunities for more little wins like that, right? Because all those little wins of adding a little bit more variety here, a little bit more variation here, a little bit more kind of interaction between the layers. When those all add on top of each other and compound, that's how you get that complexity. Because I think a lot of people look at this stuff and they go, this looks very complex. It's 600 nodes, right? But really, you're looking at 600 very simple things stacked on top of each other to create the illusion it's complex, right? A lot of things work like this. You just have to understand the little bits and piece them all together, which I guess is a good way of summing up the whole point of my channel is to help teach the little bits so that you're able to combine them all together to create that complexity, right? I don't know how to do the complexity out of nowhere. I know how to do a lot of simple things over and over and over. And people go, oh, that looks complicated. So because these can only ever go in one direction, right? Provided by the warp angle, what you could do instead is use a vector warp. So the way this works is it'll work very similarly to the directional noise, but unlike the directional, so just like the directional noise, we have an intensity, but you'll notice we don't have an angle slider, right? So we don't get to pick a direction like we do on the directional warp. Instead, we provide a direction in the form of a vector. So a vector is just it's a combination of two directions in this case, because we're working with a texture, right? 2D, so vertical and horizontal. So it's some value in red between 0 and 1, and some value in green between 0 and 1. We'll make it warp in a new direction. So using a flood filter random color gives us essentially random directions. Not essentially, it does. So you can see in this case, we're not changing the intensity per tile, we're changing the direction they move in. So this, in my view, gets you a lot more variation. So you'll see in lots of places here, I've replaced those directional warps with vector warps for that reason. Right? It's much, much better. The cracks are now a huge part of the graph, right? It's a lot. I don't know how many of these are. I didn't count just this part, but it's a lot, right? I'd say it's probably over 120, 130. So there's more nodes here than there are in the entire basic graph, right? But there's a lot of duplication. This and this are the same thing. One of the things I want to highlight in particular is this trick. So this crack, it works very similar to the crack in the intermediate level. But what I've done here is make a second layer of cracks that's higher frequency, right? So this is just a straight up duplicate of this. But on the tile sampler, I've added more of the dots. So there's 16 by 16 in this one, and this one only has 12 by 12. And I could have pushed it even more. But the point is I have two crack textures here. One that's more zoomed out and the cells are bigger, one that's more zoomed in. And I'm essentially just going to blend them on top of each other. So we have the big cells here, and we're laying in the small cells over top of some of them so that we have these sort of subdivisions, right? We have more variety of the size of cells here, which makes a really big difference ultimately. Right? These cracks just feel a lot more interesting. Warp these again, just like we were doing in the intermediate level. The fun trick comes later here. So I beveled these, whatever it is, laid this on. So I have a really kind of, these are like hairline cracks. It's all these ones. So what I was saying about how it's complexity is a lot of simple things happening over top of each other. You can barely see these cracks. They show up every once in a while, quite minorly, like this is them here. But you feel them. You feel the presence of them, right? So all like, I think this is like 40 nodes, 50 nodes. The effect is relatively small. We can turn up the intensity a lot so you can see them more easily. You can kind of see them all over the place now. Yeah, these big things. But having them on this kind of low intensity, I just want people to feel them and not necessarily see them, right? It's not supposed to be the super obvious thing, but when you do feel them, they feel kind of authentic because they have a lot of variety to how big the shape is, how thin the line is. They're not perfectly straight. There's big shapes, small shapes. So again, it's contributing to that sense of like stacked complexity, right? This second section here, this bigger crack section, this is where a lot of the really interesting cracks happen. Like this stuff feels quite good. And what's going on here that's interesting, basically at this point, the exact same thing is up here, right? We wind up with just some cracks. That's the same thing here. It's just a different version of it. The real fun trick comes here. And what's going on here is I'm tapering the cracks so that they're thicker at the tile edge, and they thin out as they go into the middle of the tiles. So I've made videos on this too. I think it's something like ZBrush sculpts in Designer, basically. The long and short of this trick is that I take a beveled version of our cracks here, and I'm going to subtract I took this is just our tile borders. And if I bevel this inwards, like this, and put an auto level here, I'm basically just making I probably want to smooth this a little too. So I'll go to our bevel and add a bit of smoothing. I'm basically just making a black and white mask where the brighter values are at the edge of the tiles and the darker values are in the middle. And what I do is subtract that from our crack bevel here. And you can see that widens the cracks at the edge because they're getting subtracted and getting darker, and leaves the middles intact. And when you histogram scan this, you get this tapering effect. So the middle of the tiles are the cracks are way thinner in the middle of the tiles than they are at the edges, which is a really, really cool effect and is a lot more similar to what we're seeing in pieces of the reference. Right, like we get a thicker line here and then it thins out as the crack extends into the middle. So again, it's just looking at the reference and going, well, let's make that, essentially, right? It seems, like I said, very five-head, but it's just, hey, look at your reference and do the thing that's in the reference. Part of when you're learning is that you don't necessarily know how to replicate that, so that's what these videos are about. What's really cool about this is we can also control that taper by leveling the texture we're using to subtract from the cracks. Right, so if I push the gray out, I can increase how quickly it tapers, or do the reverse. It doesn't taper until very late. Right, I have a ton of control here to control exactly how these lines taper, which is really, really sweet. And then if I want to increase the size of them at the beginning, that's also no problem. I just have to increase the initial width of the edge. This is going to step through the whole graph. But you see the cracks are now much wider at the base, and then they spend more time thinning out. So again, really great. I can just control the overall width. That's going to be really big. I can control the overall width of the crack in one place, and then control the taper in another place. So you can really quickly, especially if you have a computer that has enough memory that this is pretty fast, or a fast CPU, you can really control the quality of these cracks really easily, which is great. So these cracks have made a huge step forward here, just because of those few tricks, right? Mixing in the high and low frequency cracks into each other, then using this subtraction trick to kind of taper those cracks where we want them to. Another big difference here that was fun is we took the cracks here and sloped them right over here. You can see this adds slopes to all of our cracked tiles. And those slopes are being driven by that same texture we used to subtract from the cracks earlier. If we use a flood filter gradient, we could have just used a flood filter gradient and done some random angles. Right, so it'll step through the graph and add all those. I'm also just going to turn up my tessellation so you can see this a bit better. Turn that way up. So this just adds some random slopes to those cracked sections. And turn this up even more. But I don't think the random slopes really make a ton of sense. I can also make it a lot more intense for a second. I want the cracked tiles, these sections, to tilt inwards towards the center of the tiles. So I can actually grab this mask, plug it into the slope input of the flood filter gradient, and crank up the slope image input multiplier. And that means they're going to take their orders for what direction they should be facing from that input texture. They're going to kind of face in, they're going to face away from the white towards the black. And then if I just apply a 90-degree rotation, they'll do the reverse. But you'll see how these now all slope towards the middle where they broke. Right, this tile, they slope in towards the center of the tile instead of just being random, which I think adds a bunch of variety, a bunch of believability too. They should crack and kind of fall inward. They shouldn't just like go in random directions. So we added a ton of just variety there as well. And in other ways, the cracks work a lot similar to the intermediate, but I think it's much, much better. Grout is still even better. Made some more improvements there. There's a whole other layer of cracks here. Whole new third layer. This time the cracks actually raise up. Right, so if you have the base layer of cracks, these ones jump up. So they're screened on. And that allows you to get these things where the cracks actually jump up. Which I was, again, just looking at the reference. You can see here like that the cracks, it looks like that tile actually skips up a little. So I wanted to imitate that. So we have a lot more different types of crack here, but I think it really does add to that just variety that you'd expect out of real material. Same thing with the grout. We added these grout lines so that they jump up here. So that was very simple, right? Just grab the cracks of our tiles, right? That's like the initial tile generator right from the very beginning of the graph. Blurred it a bunch, inverted it, gave it a little bit of a curve, and we're just screening that on. And I can increase how much of it there is, right? If I make that stronger, this doesn't really make a ton of sense. But you can see that this does add a lot to have that grout sort of like squish up in the corners where those tiles would have like been laid, and it would have like up between the cracks to fill it. So it's, again, just adding a little bit more interest to it. Going to the albedo, the big difference here is I'm not even using a gradient dynamic anymore. Or sorry, a gradient map anymore. What I'm doing instead is actually I'm importing that texture physically into the graph. And I want to get rid of that grout. So the way I'm doing that is I was looking through the channels of the texture. So hitting R for red, G for G, B for blue, A for alpha, and I'm seeing where is the grout most isolated. And it seemed like the green channel. So I took the green channel and histogram scanned it, and I basically isolated the grout. Or pretty close to it. And then put it into a distance node. And that allowed me to close up the grout. So it's not this super dark section. And I'm sending this all throughout the graph to be sampled. Right? It's all over the place. Doing the exact same thing it was doing in the other graph. Right? Running through different gradient dynamics. The difference with the gradient dynamics in the advanced is now I'm blending together multiple ones. So I have two gradient dynamics here where I'm just moving the position to sample a different part of the texture. And then I'm blending between two gradients with a texture. And then blending those on top of each other. So the blending is a lot more deliberate, and we have a lot more variety, right? We've basically doubled or quadrupled the amount of gradient maps being used here. And we're interacting with them in interesting ways. In the intermediate, it was just this getting blended over top the original. And that was it. But now we're taking two gradient dynamics, blending between them with a mask, and then blending them with a mask over and over and over. And you get that effect, right? Of this subtle buildup of noises. As we progress through the albedo, right? This new noise, it isn't uniformly, we didn't just plaster this on top of everything, right? We took it and much more selectively said, hey, you should only go on certain tiles, and we'll add another noise on top of that, right? So this makes that noise weaker on some tiles, stronger on others, and then adds this mask on top of it as well to just create even further breakup. So some tiles have a lot more of this like really high frequency noise, and then it chills out in other areas, right? So you can see, hopefully, you're starting to see the separate layers of noise there and how they're layered on top of each other. A cool thing here is just to take a look at this pixel processor. So we haven't done a ton of these in the channel. I will definitely be making a video on them explicitly at some point, for sure. But what I'm using it for here is sort of interesting. You can use a gradient dynamic, and that's what I'm using all over the place down here. where this difference from a gradient map is you plug in color and then you plug in a grayscale texture. So I could take a flood fill to random grayscale and close up this gap like this, right? So whenever we're closing up that gap, you plug the flood fill into the source input of the distance, and you plug whatever went into the flood fill into the mask input and set it to full and only source. So this gradient dynamic, it's just going to use these grayscale textures as an input and remap them to a strip of color from this texture. And the strip of color it's choosing is the very first horizontal row of pixels. That's what, when you're setting the orientation here, right? If I picked vertical, it'd be the very first vertical column of pixels, right? And I can scroll through this to pick maybe not column 1, but column 2 or column 3 or column 4 and so on and so forth, right? And just scan through the texture. The limitation with this, I think this feels much better, the pixel processor we built. And it's subtle, but it adds up. What's going on? The problem with the gradient dynamic is we're limited to picking only a certain horizontal row of pixels from the color image or a certain vertical column of pixels from the input image. So we're not able to get a really good representation of all the possible pixels on the texture. It's just a single column or a single row, which, you know, it can be okay, right? Like sometimes that will work, but a better thing to do is to use a pixel processor. You can see the jump between these two. We have a lot more variety in here than we have in this one, because this one just, let's say it grabs a vertical row and it grabs one from right here. It's never really going to grab this kind of cool orange color or that cool dark green because it just isn't in that column. So I built a pixel processor here. And what this does, the pixel processor, when you build one, it doesn't do anything by default. But you hit that edit function button there, you see it opens up a new function graph, and in here we're able to do a bunch of math essentially, using shader code to operate on each pixel and do some sort of, any kind of operation really, on each pixel of the input textures. And so there's nothing plugged in. When you plug something in, you'll see it automatically goes, hey, do you want something else? You plug something else in, it'll go, hey, do you want something else? And it'll just keep doing that, right? So you can input whatever you'd like. But what I've chosen to input is the positions of these tiles. And the way I did that was just, I got a flood fill to position. I made a distance node of it. What the flood fill to position is this is just the position of each of our tiles. So if you look at the red channel, this is their horizontal position, going from farthest left is black to furthest right is white. And in the green channel, furthest like up at the top is black and furthest at the bottom is white. And you're seeing a combination of that. So this basically gives the texture coordinates for where each tile is, right? Each one of our tiles here, where it appears on the UV sheet. So I'm plugging that into the pixel processor, and I'm plugging our color input in as well. So our position is in input 0, and the texture we want to sample for color is in input 1. And what I'll do when I'm in here is you'll see these look very different. Right? And like I said, we're going to make a whole video on pixel processors at some point in the future, right? But this is just a little taste of something they can do, right? It's a good practical example of what they can do. So I need to get a float 2. This is I need to sample UV coordinates. So if I go up to the drop-down box here, you see these variables that all have that $sign. That means they're a system variable. So I didn't build these, right? They come with every graph you make. Like every graph has size pause, time, right? All of these nodes just exist in every graph. So I'm going to grab pause, the position, and I'm going to use this to sample one of the color textures we've plugged in. And I'm going to sample image input 0, which is our position map. So I'm making sure that it's set to image 0, which it is. You'll notice there's no output node. to plug this into. In a pixel processor, what you want to do to make an output is you actually have to specify a node as the final output. So I just right click on this, any node, and go set as output. So right now, our pixel processor is doing nothing. It's just taking image input 0 and displaying it. What we want to do, though, is use these as UV coordinates to sample our other texture. So you can see the different colored nodes in here. This just tells you what data type this is, right? So you have float 1 is this light green. Float 2, so this is 2 numbers, is this darkish green. That's the same as this, right? Our position is one of these, just 2 numbers, a vertical position and a horizontal position. Float 3 is 3 numbers, so this is like a color, right? Like if we set this to 1, 0, 0, that's red, right? 1 in red, 0 in green, 0 in blue. If we set this as the output, we would need to use a float 4 because this pixel processor wants a float 4. We would just be making red, right? If we put this to 1 as well, we get magenta. We put them all to 1, we get white. So you have these different data types, right? Float 1, float 2, float 3, float 4. So a single number, 2 numbers, like UV coordinates, positions, which is what we're dealing with right now. Float 3, so a color, RGB, or position in 3D space, XYZ. And then a float 4. So this is like RGBA, the A being an alpha channel, right? So you can't have these types of data interact with each other. They're different. So I need to take just the red and green channel of this texture. So to do that, you're going to get a vector, a swizzle float 2. Well, we'll need to get a swizzle float 4, I believe. No. Swizzle float 1. I'm on Unreal Brain right now. So this allows us to just take one of the channels. So I'm going to take, well, let me just take both. This was a float 2. So this grabs just, this is a vector 4 right now, right? You can see it's got a dark blue node. And we're basically turning it into just a float 2 by taking just X and Y, the first 2 channels. And I'm going to use these to sample another color. And this time, sample image input 1. And you can see this actually samples the colors of whatever pixel is directly below them, right? Really cool. So you're now sampling the whole texture instead of just grabbing a single vertical or horizontal column. This doesn't seem like much. It's a decent introduction to a pixel processor, and it's definitely the case that you get more variety out of this over time. Again, it's a bunch of small things stacked on top of each other that really add up over time. If you didn't want to do it this way, you could also use a flood fill to color and plug your color input texture in. And it is essentially the same thing, right? A lot simpler. I just wanted to show you it in the pixel processor to show you what they can do, because you can extend this much further than this if you have to make adjustments, right? You can do a lot more interesting things with it. But just an example of something you can do with it. At any rate, the albedo in this version of the texture is much more interesting. We have a lot more interesting blends. We're blending between multiple gradient dynamics. It's a lot more interesting. Another cool thing is when we laid on these white cracks, I actually built these by myself this time, right? I basically took, at the end of the day, I wind up with this crack texture that I think is a lot more similar to the way the cracks actually looked in the reference. Instead of using that just like, I think I used one of the substance, I used directional scratches, I think, and added a bunch of random. This is not exactly what they look like. I think this looks much better. So it's just one of those things where I think building it from scratch, you have a lot more control, right? And I think we got those white cracks to look a lot more like how they look in the reference and they feel a little bit more customized to the graph. Right, we get a lot closer. And same thing, we're not laying them over at full intensity over everything. Right, we could have if we just deleted this. Every tile gets the same intensity of crack. But we can take this and go, hey, you should be less strong on certain tiles, more strong on others. And then I made the mask even more interesting by blending a noise over top of it. And now even on one tile, it's varied up. It's a little bit more intense on this part of the tile, pretty weak on this part of the tile. Right, so it sounds like sort of like old advice that we've gone over a lot, but that is what a lot of designer is. You're just doing a lot of repetitive stuff at some point. But like I said, it's a lot of repetitive stuff stacked on top of each other gives you that complexity. The pattern is very similar to the way we had it into the intermediate section. The one thing I will note is that what I did was, instead of letting these just be flat colors at the end of the day, I decided to add a bunch of color variation. So it's not all just one green. There's a bunch of different greens in here. Just because it would have been like worn, and, you know, the colors shouldn't stay perfectly the same throughout, like, you know, the decades maybe this has been here. We should get kind of subtle color variations. The way I did this was sort of this kind of neat trick you can do. If you want, I love the look of these. I think they're so nice. What I did to make that, I'm just taking this color texture and just blending it on over top with a soft light at really low intensities. If I put it up really high, you can see the variation gets really intense. It's like a galaxy. But on low intensity, it does a really good job of just breaking the colors up. The way I made this was just to take an RGBA merge, right? So this just takes 4 grayscale channels and plugs them into each other to make a color texture. And all I did was, you can take any noise you want. Like, you could take a moisture noise, plug it into red. We just have a red texture, right? Wherever this was black, we're getting 0 red. And wherever this was white, we're getting full red. But I can take versions of this noise, like rotate this, maybe offset a little bit, plug that into green as well, right? And now we have random green pixels and random red pixels. And then I'm going to move it again and plug it into blue. And now we have just random colors. And it doesn't have to be the moisture noise. You could do this with whatever you want, right? I mean, this won't look as interesting. It's very funny. We've accidentally made like a bowling alley from the 90s or something. But any noise will work, right? Black and white spots. And we get these really different ending looks. You can even just use a cloud or whatever. Right, so you can build up a lot of really interesting kind of just general breakups with this. I can even histogram scan this so that it's not as like soft and diffuse. It's a bit more blurred. Right, you get a lot of really cool stuff here. And I wouldn't want to use this at like full intensity everywhere, but blending that in kind of at a soft intensity over top of those colors really does a lot to break it up. At the end of the day, and our pattern breakup texture, right? This is where we're blending in our albedo that has no pattern and our albedo that has the pattern everywhere. This breakup texture is much more interesting than it was even in intermediate. In intermediate, it was just a cloud that we were scanning. But here, we probably spend, 25 nodes making this cool mask. So we're able to do things like, we'll start with like a moisture noise, histogram scan it, subtract it from the pattern, get some higher frequency noise, subtract that, right? And this is quite severe, this noise. It's like scanned really highly to like actually peel it away in certain areas. We're even grabbing like the edges of the tile, inverting them and multiplying them so that at the edges of the tile, the noise, the paint sort of peels away at the edges. So really, we're just spending a lot more time making this mask so that at the end of the day, when we put our color pattern texture over top, it's integrated in a much more interesting way. Same thing we've been doing, right? We're just trying to create that stacked layer of complexity. And then finishing it off really in the roughness map, we're just pulling way more stuff from the albedo. And at the end, it's the exact same thing we did earlier. And we're also using masks. right? To blend these all in. Instead of just laying this over at full intensity, I'm using a mask in the mask input so that we get a bit of both, right? You can see the different types of noises. And that's really, it's the same thing as the other graph, but we're just doing more of it and making sure to use masks to break up where we blend those things on. And you can see at the end of the day, we wind up with a really effective roughness mask, which has a lot of different scales of detail. We're able to control this all really different. Like I decided to matte the painting out in this one, but there's no reason why I couldn't decide the opposite. Like go in here and say, hey, I actually want you to get much darker, right? I want the paint to be smoother and shinier, right? You have a lot of options here. And these sorts of options is what I'm talking about I would be doing with that extra 4 hours I mentioned, where this is basically, I have all the hooks I need, right? I have every like ingredient I need to be able to tweak. And the next 4 hours is just going to be me going through and making all those micro adjustments, maybe adding a little thing here, tweaking this here or there. But the point is, this is where I think people are at after, you know, it can be after like several months of using Substance Designer if you put your nose to it, right? If you really kind of like put your nose to the grindstone, you can get really far with this pretty quickly. But I hope the big thing I wanted to come through with this is that this is 640 nodes, 657 nodes, right? A lot of them are duplicates. There's very few really interesting tricks in here. It's a lot of just more kind of normal things, but a lot of them stacked on top of each other, and that's what creates that complexity. And that's the thing I really want people to get through here, is that you can do this. If you're feeling like you're more at the point where you're making that kind of basic level one, you are not many steps away from being able to make the advanced one, right? If this is where you're at, you're very close. It's really just expanding on how you blend those things together. They're all little tricks that you're stacking on top of each other at really high amounts to create that advanced level. You're very, very close, I promise. All right, well, YouTube clickbait complete. We did it, everyone. We got through it. I'm really happy with this one. You know, I see a lot of channels I follow that just do, you know, aquarium building, and they do these sort of like aquarium aquascape done in 5 levels of complexity, or like Warhammer model painted in 5 levels of expertise. And I wanted to do that with something I think that I have some information on. And I'm hoping that along the way, we found a bunch of teachable moments of like how you go about jumping maybe from beginner to intermediate, or from intermediate to advanced. So no matter where you are in the skill level here, I think you are much closer to the next one than you think you are. I've been doing this a really long time, and I'm still hopefully getting better. I think a bit slower than I probably did when I started. Just trying to squeeze every drop of it I can out of each piece. But you are closer to the next level than you think you are. It's just understanding that, kind of adding all those layers of complexity, slowly building that up. So I hope you found that helpful. It wasn't exhaustive, right? It's more just the key waypoints I thought were interesting. If you want the entire walkthrough of just the advanced one, right? I did a real-time build through of the advanced material. It took 7 hours, right? So, and it's a 7-hour tutorial. It goes through it in real time, node by node, and I don't assume you know anything. We go through and explain every single decision I'm making, every single choice I'm making, and I try to bring along everyone with me. So even if you're brand new, you should be able to follow it and get exactly the graph I have, more or less, by the end of the day. So if you'd like to go check that out, I appreciate you can head over to Patreon. The link is in the description. It's on the channel page. You can find it. If you're able to support me there, I really appreciate it. You can also download the graph for the full material. So if you'd like to follow through with it while you're following the tutorial, and you'd like to just like follow along, like I learn really well that way, so you can get them there as well. If you don't want to do that right now, totally understand. I'd appreciate like a subscribe here. It takes 2 seconds, especially turning on the notifications, because I'm making the videos at a pretty reasonable clip at this point. They're coming out fairly frequently, at least 2 or 3 a month. So if you turn on the bell, it really helps. You know, you get notified when new stuff comes out. I still get people that were around from that kind of first batch of videos a year or 2 ago that don't know I'm back making stuff, right? So turning on that subscription notification bell, hit the bell, etc., does a good job of just letting you know when new stuff comes out if you're interested. And both of those things massively help the channel as well. So I really appreciate the support there. the Patreon, like this video is a result of voting on the Patreon, right? I have a huge laundry list of stuff I'd like to cover. Like I have a million big, you should see the spreadsheet, right? There's a ton of stuff I'd like to go over. But this is an idea that came from the Discord, right? So we have a Discord community now and people are just showing off their work and, how to tackle certain problems, or they're asking, how would you approach a certain problem of each other, right? They're really kind of helping each other out. And that's been surprising how good that's been, right? And this, in other ideas of recent stuff, comes from those. So if you'd like to be part of those, you can do that as well. But other than that, I really appreciate you sticking out. It's a very long one. I'm looking at the timestamps of these videos over the last couple months and just seeing the average video length just climb up. We're now like, if I can keep it under 2 hours, I'm doing a good job.